Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I'm Dr. David Pendergrass. I want to pick up where I left off last time. I was talking about a conversation with Michael, who calls himself an atheist, on my Facebook page. And last time we talked about several things, but what we particularly responded to at the very end of part one was the fact that to really determine if a text is historically reliable or not, the first thing most scholars do is try to determine what kind of genre the text is. Once they determine what the genre is, then they know what kind of questions to ask. For example, if you asked what kind of genre is a psalm, you know it's a hymn book. A hymns are trying to write songs. It does not preach to you. It represents the theology of the psalmist who's writing the song. It might reference historical events, but that's not the point of the Psalms. So to ask questions of historical reliability, is it true that the trumpets blared out on the temple that day, is maybe to ask the wrong question of the text for the Psalms. If, however, it says Jesus was crucified outside the city gates of Jerusalem, that's something that matters a whole lot, because as an ancient form of biography, the Gospels, in fact, are trying to record historical events with freedom. An ancient biography is not like a modern biography. Modern biographies care about, say, Winston Churchill, where he was born, when he was born, his parents, his dog's name, what kind of food his dog ate. And you want to stick to the facts as much as possible, and then bring out some of his charm and his adages, his anecdotes, those kinds of things. But an ancient biography was different. They focused on demonstrating the character of the protagonist. So they don't care much about chronology. They don't care much about the details. They care more about the overall character that they're trying to portray. But it is a form of ancient history. That's exactly how they understood biography. You need to go read a guy named Richard Bauckham. He wrote a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Richard Bauckham, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. I think it is the most compelling case for a substrata basis of tradition of the oral text of the Gospels based on eyewitness testimony that I've ever read in my life. It is outstanding. Richard Bauckham, Jesus and Eyewitnesses. Then you need to read Richard Burridge, What Are the Gospels? What Are the Gospels? It's the standard work on the genre of the Gospels. Now, I'm giving some examples of Gospels, but I could give examples of books like that for all the other texts. But my point is, if you really do want to learn about genre, then you got some reading to do. If you want an overall book about genre, go read How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by a New Testament scholar and an Old Testament scholar, Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart. How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. It's an overview of all the genres of the Bible. Go read those books, then read the Bible. It'll be awesome. Let me pick up on Michael's comments from before. After he talks about it can't be like Captain America and so forth, I addressed that issue by saying, Michael, you got to demonstrate that the Bible, any of the biblical books, at minimum the 66 books, are in fact de facto fictions like a comic book. So instead of starting with the assumption that it's all make-believe, start with the assumption that it's an ancient document. And by the way, let me say real quickly here, this is so important to remember, and I do not mean this condescending, but almost every skeptic, atheist, agnostic I've ever chatted with doesn't understand this point. Now, I don't know what Michael thinks about this, so maybe, Michael, you do get this already, but most, in my experience, don't. They really do think the Bible is one big fat book, and that's it. It's like a modern book. It's one big modern book you go buy at the store. That's not how any scholars see it. We see it as a collection or library of ancient texts. That's really important to remember. When the books were being written, the original letters, the original books, the original songs, the original poems, they were not written to be collected into a big collection, what we call a canon, from the Greek word kanon, for a list of things or an order or the measure of something. They were not written to be put aside together so that later on Jews and Christians can walk around with their Bible. They were independent documents written. Now, they were eventually collected, but you should not ever think when you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that you're basically just reading one big modern book. These are 4 independent sources of what happened in Jesus' life. Now, Matthew and Luke clearly use Mark, But there's a lot of uniquely Matthean material and uniquely Lucan material, and John also has tons of unique stuff about Jesus. So there is unique material in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Not to mention Paul and his letters, and of course John's letters, and James, and Hebrews, and Revelation, and so forth. So these are a bunch of ancient documents, and that's why historians study them. Now, as Christians, yes, Christians come to the conclusion that they are in fact inspired. But what I'm saying is, you do not have to assume that they are written by God to think they're authoritative. If all you had was historical reliability alone, you would see them as historical documents that should be listened to and read. You might not follow Jesus, but you don't dismiss them. No historian dismisses them outright just because they don't have every event corroborated and just because you say, well, it's not inspired by God. No. Historians don't, they use different measures of success to decide whether or not it's historical. They are historical. The question now is, can they be corroborated? For the Christian, we have the additional faith statement of, are they inspired? Now, I do believe the texts are, as it were, originally generated from the mind of God, but that's a different issue and a different day. Okay, so I'm just trying to remind you that the Bible is not a book. It's not a modern book. It's an ancient library. Then each one is different, each genre is different. Michael continues in his comments for me. He says, for example, we know who the various kings the Bible references were real people. Now let me pause there and say, well, we know that most of them, we don't have a lot of extra biblical evidence that all of them existed, but Michael assumes that we know that, so I'm not sure where he gets his evidence from. But then he says, but there was never a global census taken. I'm going to pause little by little. My response is, but there was never. My question to you then, Michael, is what evidence do you have that there was never a global census taken? See, when you make a claim like that, you have to have evidence for it. So what evidence do you have that it never occurred? Secondly, what are you talking about? I don't know anything in the Bible that says there was a global census taken. The only thing I can think of at all, as he's mentioning, was the census taken in the Roman Empire, but that's not a global census. That's the Roman Empire, because his next phrase he says, nor did the order in carrying out of the slaughter of innocents in lieu of the announcement of Jesus' birth. I think he means when Quirinius was governor, and so forth. Well, if that's the case, when he says we know it didn't happen, you need evidence to demonstrate we know it didn't happen. At best, Michael, what you would say is, I don't think it happened, but you don't have evidence that it did not happen. So the question is, okay, why do you think it didn't happen? But all I'll say that is, we do have evidence in Egypt, just not long at all before the birth of Jesus, there was an empire-wide Egyptian demand for census taking. So it happened in the neighbors of Jesus' hometown. It just happened, and basically his parents and grandparents' time, that a massive census was demanded. So now maybe you dismiss that. Maybe you say, nope. Even in Egypt, it didn't happen because we don't have extra Egyptian material sources. That is, for Michael, for you to trust it, you need 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 6, 7 sources to corroborate it. Then you'll believe it happened. And I don't know what your magic number is. I don't know what any skeptic's magic number before they'll finally believe it. I don't know. I mean, everyone decides for themselves. All I know is whatever measure you give to the Bible, any biblical text or literary text in the Bible, my question is going to be, do you demand the same amount of evidence for any other ancient text? We have very little corroborating evidence for any of the Roman emperors. Very little. Suetonius, Dio-Cassius, these Roman historians, we know very little at all about what they said. Now, we have some corroboration, but scholars of Roman history do not assume the whole thing is make-believe, like a comic book, and they're just filling in some gaps with historical facts. And not moreover, the manuscripts come centuries after that occurred. Even they wrote the documents centuries after they occurred. We have Gospels, for example, the Gospels written within the lifetime of the people of Jesus. Last year, they discovered 3 or 4 manuscripts, I think 4. It's 4 and 3 are from Mark, or 3 and 2 are from Mark, from the 1st century. That's in the lifetime of Mark, the author. We have manuscripts that date to his time period. There's nothing like that on the planet. So all I'm saying at this point is, you need evidence that the census did not occur. And on top of that, you're right, we don't have much corroborating at all. But we do have evidence that that kind of thing, a census, could take place. And then he goes on to say, these are two examples I can cite where the Bible gets history dead wrong. Well, see, that's a huge certainty that Michael has, you have. That's, I guess, fine, but scholars don't have your certainty. Scholars just don't, because we need evidence to be certain. We can't be certain otherwise. Then he says you don't have evidence of a global flood. It's not only impossible, but we can tell for certain that it never happened. Again, how do we know for certain it never happened? It's only impossible. Why is it impossible? Those kind of things. And moreover, you have to go to Genesis and figure out exactly the global flood. He talks about the house of David, and then he goes on, that's great, he existed, so forth, but what, and then this sentence here is kind of confused. What can you show that demonstrates the claimed divinity in the same way as King David existed? I think he meant that Jesus claimed to be divine. And then he says that anything involving Jesus had been corroborated without citing Josephus, which is a known forgery. This is kind of evidence and interest, the wording here is weird, is interested in when it comes to the Bible. Again, he's saying a lot there. I'm not going to reference to all that because this is handled in scholarship. There are three different references in Josephus, the Jewish scholar of the time, historian. There are three references to Jesus, and one of them gets a lot of attention because he mentions Jesus being a miracle worker and being the Messiah. And it's debated whether or not certain phrases in that quote from Josephus, that one of the three, it's debated whether or not Josephus would really ever say Jesus was the Messiah, since Josephus was a Jew, and as far as we know, never a Christian. And he's probably right, but all of it is not doubted, just certain phrases in Josephus. Anyway, the bigger question about, do we have evidence that Jesus was divine? Again, what kind of evidence do you need, Michael? I don't have a laboratory. I mean, really think about it. What would it take to convince you that Jesus did things only God-kind can do? I wrote a whole chapter about this in my book. It's a big deal. It's a very good question, and there needs to be good answers. The short answer I'll give you, without giving 4 podcasts and just reading my entire chapter via podcast, would be the way to answer the question is this. You ask the question, what did a Jew in the first century think that only God could do? What did a Jew in the first century think that only God could do? The good news is we got a lot of literature that tells us precisely what probably the average Jew thought about what God did and what kind of honor was due him. Then we compare that to the life and ministry and teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. What is striking is he does things only deity or divinity does. So, for example, only God creates. Well, Jesus creates bread and fish at minimum, out of nothing. He creates things out of nothing. Only God controls nature, has command of it, command of nature. Jesus has command of nature. Only God commands the human race to do things on his own authority. The Jews never gave commandments on their own authority. They might report on behalf of God, but Jesus reports as if he is possessing divine prerogative to say, nope, do this. Not just because God told me. I'm not reciting something God said. I'm telling you do this, and it carries the weight as if God himself, God the Father, said it. Only God judges. Jesus assumes he judges. Jesus assumes that he can heal. Only God heals. Not because Jesus is just a conduit. He just does some magic or incantation and so forth. No, it assumes that he can do it. Of course, Jesus forgives people. Every Jew believed only God forgives people. Not that Jesus said, God forgives you, but I forgive you, or you are forgiven. So he forgave people their sins. I could go down long, even more there. I addressed 6 or 7 major things in my chapter. Moreover, everybody, from the earliest strata of evidence we have, assumed that Jesus was, in fact, God-kind. They assumed it. Now, maybe everybody was wrong. Really, that's a possibility. Maybe every single person was wrong, including the opponents of Jesus, people like Saul Paul, who converted in the faith. Saul Paul was not a disciple. He was not a BFF of Jesus. He changed sides. Even he came to believe that Jesus was not a mere dude. So you need to explain why everybody assumed from the earliest strata we have that Jesus was not just a dude, and that he just wasn't. So there are all kinds of things like that. and it's in my chapter of my book, A Skeptic Challenges a Christian. And then the last thing Michael says, ultimately, it seems strange to me that all these hoops need to be jumped through in order to help perpetuate the stories. It seems to me that I can understand we're good to have any hand in the writing. Maybe he said, we're God to have any hand in writing the Bible, inspired otherwise. He'd have done a far better job of communicating his message so that all who read it would be immediately convinced. Seems to me an omnipotent being who was giving us a book in the first place would be willing to be able to do in such a way that 2,000 years later, there are those of us but skeptic nature who simply can't bring ourselves to believe these stories as they are converted in the pages of the Bible itself. Shouldn't all this history and archaeology be irrelevant if a good and perfect being tried to reveal a book of truth? Why would the church founders ever be allowed to leave books out of the canon? Well, this last thing, why would the church leave books out? I would say that's another whole issue. The reason why they left it out of the canon is chiefly because it did not fit. It was very important to the early church fathers. Now, again, I've got all kinds of books I can reference here. I can be happy to send your way, but this is a PhD in historical theology talking. I've read the primary sources. It was a big deal to the early church fathers that the documents in the New Testament, at least, come from within the life of the authors themselves. They referenced in the early 2nd century really good important books like the Didache, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Letter of Barnabas, the Letters of Polycarp, 1 Clement. These books were considered very important and were published in Bibles for a long time. The problem was, they said, they just not were written within the 1st century. So that's why most of the books had a very easy time of not being included. Some books that made it eventually had a hard time, like the book of Revelation. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, the book of Revelation was debated until the 8th, 9th century of getting included in the canon. But most books in the New Testament were settled early on within the first couple of centuries was done. But I only end up on the last question of why wouldn't it be easier for us skeptics to believe? I hear that, and I've heard that one a whole lot in my life. And my response is, I don't have a pithy saying. I've heard William Lane Craig and other people say, well, if you'll just believe long enough, if you'll just keep searching, you'll find it. And I've heard other people say that if you really were open-minded, you'd find it. Maybe all these things are true. My response is, I don't know why you don't believe. I don't know. Belief comes slowly for some people. Some people, it just takes longer. Some may never get there. There's all kinds of possible reasons. And from a Christian worldview, and evil really does exist, you might be attacked by evil. Jesus believed in evil. I believe in evil too. Maybe you're attacked by evil. Maybe it's a spiritual issue. Maybe it's a cognitive issue. For a whole lot of skeptics, it's an emotional, psychological reason. They're just being blocked by all kinds of reasons. I have a whole podcast on, and you need to listen to the podcast. I would encourage you, psychological reasons, or I think I called it reasons not to believe in God. I give a whole host of reasons why people would do that. So I don't know why you are not convinced, Michael. I do know many, many people who read the Bible and are convinced immediately. Jews and Gentiles. They're convinced right away because they read it. I know people who go through degrees like I have done and are even much, much more convinced and compelled, like myself. I know of people who went through rigorous training and left the faith. Their questions were so emotionally bothersome, sometimes logically, cerebrally, bothersome, that they left the faith. People like Bart Ehrman, but that's a different issue too. I'm convinced his was emotionally a component to that as well. All that to say, no, we don't always agree on the conclusions. You could get all your degrees like I have and come to different conclusions and say, nope, I need every single detail to be corroborated, or I'm dismissing the whole show. Well, then that's your prerogative. You can do that. Now, as a Christian, I'm convinced that you'll be held accountable for what you do, that it's a moral issue. What you decide matters. There's a consequences. Like, I don't open up my medicine cabinet and start taking pills just in case one of them happens to help me. There are consequences for taking the wrong medicine or taking the right medicine. I think truth works that way. But I would say this at the very end to encourage you, and that is this. I really encourage you, skeptic, if you're listening, whoever you are, or if you're a Christian and having your doubts, I would do what I did when I almost left the faith. Figure out what the non-negotiables are of the Christian faith. Figure out what your pillars are. And whatever your questions are, get them answered. Don't give up. Don't give up. And the non-negotiables of the Christian faith must include things like this. Did Jesus really exist? Did the things he say really come out of his mouth? Even basically, did he really die? Was he really crucified? And of course, was he really raised to new life in a resurrection? At minimum, is that true? If at minimum those things are true, then why in the world would you not commit yourself to the King of the universe? My faith is not, and it never will be, in whether or not I can corroborate the flood narrative. I just don't care. I don't care. The flood narrative is not in one of the major creeds of the church. I believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth, and Noah and his 2x2 elephants and birds went on the... I mean, give me a break. It doesn't matter if the slaughter of the innocents can be corroborated. My faith is not built on that foundation. And my fear and my concern with so many skeptics are, these are nothing but red herrings meant to divert the attention away from really committing to the real deal. Now, I'm not belittling. If you really are having questions, please ask the questions and go get the answers. My encouragement is that if you're listening to this and if you're being gut level honest, look, I'm not even in the car, your headphones, or whatever you're listening to this, so I don't know. You don't have to lie to me. If really what's going on is you just don't give a rip, you just don't want to believe, you just don't want to change your life because you like whatever you're doing in life or whatever, then man, I would just say admit it. But if you really are interested in learning more about the biblical facts, the biblical narrative, then get to reading or go get your degrees. But either way, there are answers to be found, really good ones, that I think you will find compelling. I think you will. And I think it starts with the non-negotiables of the Christian faith. In that, of course, I would pray to a God maybe you have a hard time believing in. Father, I'm not sure if I believe in you at all, or I know I don't. But I want to be open-minded. I want to read until I get all my questions answered. And then I'll make up my mind. If you're there, show it to me. And I think you're going to be shocked what happens. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. If you want to listen to more, go to my website, davidpendergrass.com, and look at one of the tabs that says podcast. If you click that, it'll take you straight to my podcast on iTunes, or you can search for it on iTunes if you want to, A Glimpse of the Kingdom. But also on my website, you'll see another way to get, if you're an Android listener on your phone or you just don't use Mac computers. Again, davidpendergrass.com, and click podcast. It'll take you exactly where you need to go, and you can subscribe from there and get this as often as you like, and also see my blogs and so forth. If you want to get me to come to your organization or church, otherwise to do some consulting, you need to go to davidpendergrassconsulting.com. davidpendergrassconsulting.com. You'll see the information there. If you want to reach out to me on Twitter, you can find me at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass.